Very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll start just by aligning my comments with the good ranking member and Representative Dubitsky, speaking in favor of the amendment that is before us. I also want to add my voice as a proponent of this amendment. I offered a bill for constitutional carry this session as well. They've already mentioned the two main points that I might have covered. One is that there is no data that would indicate that eliminating the requirement for a pistol permit and restoring a constitutional right properly has a negative impact on crime. In fact, it's just the opposite. And some might argue that there's not a lot of data because many of the states that have enacted constitutional carry have done it in recent years. And that is true. There are now, I believe, 27 states that practice constitutional carry. I don't know that there was more than one when I was first elected in 2010. So the point is that states are moving in that direction, and they are realizing that it makes sense to adopt this policy. The one state that had constitutional carry when I was first elected in 2010 was the state of Vermont, which Representative Dubitsky just mentioned. The interesting thing about them is they've always had constitutional carry, and yet they have many, many times topped the chart as the safest state in the entire country. That's an indication that crime is not going to go through the roof or violence. In fact, it proves a point which I'm going to get into much more deeply on the discussion of the bill, which is that the possession of firearms actually can limit and reduce crime and violent crime. And I think that's borne out by states that have open carry, states that have constitutional carry. The other issue is that this is a constitutional right. And the idea that the state or anyone else should be in a position to tell you that your right does not belong to you until you pay a fee to the state is alarming. And it should never existed in the first place. But the one thing that they had not mentioned that I would like to just add, and the reason I chose to say a few words, is simply that you're imposing a fee that might prohibit someone of lesser means from having the ability to protect themselves. We've already talked here and at the public hearing and over time about the impediments to become a lawful firearm owner and carrier of firearms in this state because of all of the stringent requirements, not to mention the failure of the current system to facilitate the obtaining of a pistol permit in certain jurisdictions, and the failure of the permits to be issued in a timely manner. Those are all factors that are directly impacting people with low incomes or people that live in urban environments from where they usually have these stricter requirements from being able to own a firearm and possess one and to carry it to protect themselves. There's long conversations in this building all the time about systemic racism. Well, that's a systemically racist policy. The fact that in urban environments, our major cities, it is much more difficult to exercise your constitutional right to defend yourself. And that is something we should fix. Constitutional carry takes a giant leap forward. Mr. Chairman, and I would encourage my colleagues to support this amendment. The Second Amendment is a fundamental natural right that every person in this room and across our great country possesses by virtue of being born. And that natural right the recognition that we have the natural, innate, inborn right to defend ourselves. And what is amazing here is that the state of Connecticut has sought to decide where it's appropriate for someone to be able to defend themselves. And that's the problem with the existing statute that prohibits someone from carrying a firearm in a state park. I want to just make a couple of points about the conversation that was just had. First off, brandishing a firearm is a completely different thing from merely possessing or carrying a firearm. And in fact, it's already a crime. So all of the examples that were mentioned about brandishing or waving around a firearm are already against the law. And I believe there are quite a few states across the country. I don't know if there are any states, actually, that have a restriction on carrying firearms in state parks. But I doubt that if they, the states where it is perfectly lawful, which maybe all of them, except for Connecticut, that kind of activity occurs. So to me, that is a specious argument. Respecting the chairman, the amendment is not about beaches. It's about state parks. Based on the conversation, it sounded like he would almost be in favor of the amendment if it were not for beaches. And I would simply suggest that if that's the case, then we should have that conversation, because any movement in the proper direction to restore the right of people to defend themselves in state parks, to me, is a victory for freedom and for the opportunity for people to restore their natural rights in Connecticut. The bill that we're going to be debating that this proposes to amend is a laundry list of items that pick apart natural rights of citizens, and for very little benefit. This amendment is just one opportunity to do something positive in the other direction, to make up for those loss of freedoms, and instead suggest that we should be honoring people's natural rights, and the Second Amendment that we are bound not to restrict by the Bill of Rights. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
I certainly have concerns about the bill language, but before I get into going through the bill, I just want to say that I think it's a shame. It's a real shame that it seems like anytime there is a tragedy, it seems like the go-to answer is more gun control, and it also seems to be the response to the day-to-day violence and murder, which I find it shocking that has become, I don't want to use the word acceptable, but rather less talked about than tragedies that happen across the country. There are violent murders occurring in our state on a regular basis, and they are very seldom discussed in this committee. And the answer to those appears to be the same gun control policies that have been discussed, passed, and discussed over again in this committee. I noticed Governor Lamont this morning was very quick to jump on the tragedy yesterday in Nashville, and of course, he was not the only person. I want to say that we certainly mourn for the people that were killed in that terrible tragedy, and we pray for their families and for that entire community. And these tragedies are something that affect every one of us, and are a concern for every one of us. And it is unbelievably frustrating when those tragedies are characterized in a way that makes people that advocate for the rights of gun owners and effectively the rights of every citizen are somehow responsible. The correct answer, by the way, if one of us was asked about that tragedy yesterday or even today, is that we should wait until we have all of the facts before we start jumping to conclusions and spouting off about quote-unquote assault weapons. That's what the public's tired of. The people on the street, when they talk about being frustrated with elected officials, Republicans and Democrats, that's what they're upset with. The idea that we're not up here working on policy together, that people are taking shots at one another and using tragedies for political gamesmanship or to raise money. It demonstrates a real lack of knowledge about the subject and the policy implications of enacting policies like the ones before us when that's the go-to response for every tragedy that occurs. And more important than that, I think it poisons the potential for any real conversation and for us to sit down and, as people, regardless of our party affiliation, to try and come up with viable solutions to prevent murders in our major cities across the state and tragedies like Sandy Hook or what happened yesterday and has happened far too often across this country. Those are terrible, terrible crimes, and we don't need politics. We need reasonable, thoughtful policy decisions. It cheapens the debate and it cheapens the value of our representation when we engage in that kind of conversation. I want to point out that the bill that is before us, I don't remember, somebody said it was 97 pages. My copy is 99 pages. It's a laundry list. It is a laundry list of what I would characterize as victimless crimes. If you go through the list, the open carrying a firearm, the possession of a ghost gun, which obviously incorporates so much more than is being described by people who are actively in favor of ghost guns. It doesn't just capture people that file off the serial numbers and then commit crimes. We're all against that. It captures a lot of people that are innocent people that are manufacturing firearms because they're very interested in the activity. But they're not criminals, and they shouldn't be treated that way. Quote-unquote bulk purchases, new licensing requirements, raising the age to purchase a long gun, storage requirements, expanding the ever-growing list of quote-unquote assault weapons. Every one of those things is victimless. Merely engaging in any of these activities doesn't harm a soul. Not a single thing on the list harms anyone by themselves. And turning these laws into, or turning these proposals into punishable laws, on the other hand, that does harm people. These laws will, if passed, cause decent, honest, law-abiding citizens who would only use their firearms in the defense of other people, and themselves, of course, it will turn them into criminals overnight. And that's just absurd. I want to point out, as I did discussing the amendment, that the Second Amendment is not something that is particularly debatable. It is a fundamental natural right that guarantees each one of us the right to defend ourselves. It is not a loophole, as was described. And this bill is not about closing loopholes. This bill is about infringing on the rights of the people that we represent in their ability to be in charge of their own person and their own defense of themselves. And, of course, this is nothing new because most of the gun control laws that have been passed in this state over the last decade or more are very similar. There are a bunch of restrictions that are victimless crimes that have no impact on stopping criminal activity or stopping gun violence or murder or any of those things. The bill that passed in the wake of Sandy Hook, I stood on the floor for hours in the House of Representatives and debated against it, making the argument that none of those things would have mattered because they wouldn't have, and they still wouldn't matter today. Changing all these requirements does nothing to control crime or prevent someone who is mentally ill or fully committed to harming others with or without a firearm from doing so. Guns are just tools. The issue at hand when it comes to violence is the intent of the person, not the object that they use. We've sadly seen people use all sorts of implements to harm one another. Bombs, cars, bats, knives, fists. I wonder if the people in the room know that the FBI statistics show that more people are murdered by bare hands than they are with long guns. Of course, we're not going to ban someone's hands. The fact of the matter is that intent is what matters, not the implement that is used. And we can pass all of the laws that you want here in Connecticut, but nothing is going to stop someone who is committed to causing harm or violence, especially when we're only capable in this body of passing state laws. They have different laws in other states. That's a newsflash. You know, you can go and obtain a firearm in another state if you need to and bring it here if you're intent on doing so. And, of course, it's a crime. Maybe or maybe not, it should be. But the fact of the matter is nothing that we're doing here is going to change that fact. And that is a fact. I also want to point out that It's often noted that Connecticut is one of the most strict laws for gun control, and we're so proud of ourselves. The people that say that are getting very lucky that we have not had another Sandy Hook since, because there is absolutely nothing that has been done by this body or this governor or his predecessor to change that. It's pure luck that we have not had another tragedy like that, because those tragedies cannot be stopped by these types of policies. I'm going to get to policies that would work in a moment, but these types of policies never will. People talk about preventing gun violence, but this bill is not about preventing gun violence. This bill is about preventing gun ownership and the exercise of natural rights. A few things about the bill itself. If this bill ever makes it to the floor, I've got a lot to say about the constitutional concerns with each section, and there are many. But I'll leave that alone for the moment and just suggest that some of these items that are listed, we must have reached the bottom of the barrel for gun control, because so much of it has been passed in the state over the last decade that they're just looking for anything that can be construed as another impediment to private gun ownership. Open carry. I don't know how often this is an issue. I've never heard of someone open carrying a firearm leading to a tragedy. In fact, states that have the open carry of firearms traditionally have less violent crime than we do. Crimes are actively prevented by the fact that there are people open carrying firearms. It's the same reason why people do not commit crimes in front of a police officer, because they don't want to be on the wrong end of the barrel of his gun. And gun ownership itself prevents crime. The fact that rural communities have a tendency to have less crime than more urban environments is a reflection on the fact that there is far more private gun ownership in rural communities and suburbs. And criminals realize that. They recognize that if they come to my home in the town of Wolcott, they are likely, in fact, I will say right now that they are guaranteed to run into someone willing to defend themselves with a firearm. That may or not be true in other cases. And that is the reason why people do not engage in as many home invasions in rural environments. Ghost guns. As I mentioned, it's not just filed off serial numbers. Every one of us would be against that, someone purposely modifying a firearm to make it untraceable for the purpose of committing a crime. That has been a crime for as long as I can remember. The notion of ghost guns is really just capturing something else entirely. And while it might not seem like that's intended by some of the rhetoric we hear, I'm afraid it is. Because what it's doing is it's preventing people that are just enthusiasts who are into firearms and manufacturing their own firearms or customizing or modifying them. They get caught up in this legislation by having to go through hoops after hoops to satisfy state laws. And none of that is going to prevent the next tragedy from happening, because those people are not the people that we have to worry about. Assault weapons. The term, anyone who follows this debate already knows, is a completely made-up term. An assault weapon is anything you assault someone with, whether it's a baseball bat or a firearm or a chair. It doesn't matter. That would be an assault weapon. But to categorize certain firearms as assault weapons is just absurd. And this body has been doing it repeatedly, forever, trying to encompass more and more firearms. But the firearms that are being captured are not any more or less lethal than any other firearms. They are more or less captured for two reasons, as far as I can tell. One, based on the way they look. You know, oh, that looks like a military firearm. I seen that in a movie the other day. Those things, you know, they spray bullets. That's a bunch of nonsense. An AR-15 is a firearm just like the one that's hanging over Granddad's mantle and fireplace. It does not fire any more bullets any more quickly than that. It's just different. And it's different because technology is different. Just like cars from the 60s had big fat chrome bumpers and were made out of like thousands of tons of steel. Obviously not thousands of tons, maybe 2 tons of steel. Modern cars are lighter, more plastic parts, no more chrome bumpers. Why? Because they're more fuel efficient, they're more aerodynamic. It's technology. And firearms have advanced too. The old wooden firearm that's hanging over the mantle I just mentioned, it weighs a ton. If you're out hunting, you don't want to be carrying that behemoth all day. So people that manufacture firearms have advanced in technology, and they offer firearms that have plastic parts that are modular, that can be used for different things and can have different stocks and different barrels and things because they have different uses. The big reason, though, that these weapons are being captured, I shouldn't call them weapons, these firearms are being captured in these types of laws, like the one before us today, is because they are in common use. That's the reason. The fact of the matter is, when you see a tragedy on TV that occurs someplace, it's not surprising to anyone that follows the gun industry or people that own firearms or are into the hobby, or they hunt, or they shoot targets, things like that. It doesn't surprise any of us because we all know that the weapons that are being used are firearms that are in common use. The AR-15 is the most commonly sold rifle in the whole country, and not because it's good for mass assaults on innocent victims. It's because it's good for lots of things: target shooting, self-defense, hunting. That's the reason. I won't get into the constitutional discussion about how firearms that are in the common use are specifically protected based on previous Supreme Court discussions. As I said, if this bill comes to the Senate, I will make a point of going through every paragraph, every sentence, and every word, and discussing just how off target this policy is. I want to close my remarks simply by explaining that there are things that we should be doing. We should be working on real solutions. We shouldn't be working to score political points. Back during the debate on the huge bill that we passed after the terrible tragedy in Sandy Hook, I suggested on the floor at the time, the way I closed my remarks at that time was I made 4 recommendations. And I'm back here making the same 4 recommendations, Mr. Chairman. The first one, I'm tremendously thankful, has had some movement. And that is that after a decade, or more actually, that I've been in this committee and in the House and in the Senate shouting about it, last year the governor actually took me up on my idea to start funding the statewide firearms trafficking task force again. And we passed it into law last year, and I'm very pleased about that. That is a policy that was enacted. It was one of the very few good things that was passed after Sandy Hook that effectively empowered law enforcement to try and get illegal guns off the streets. And, of course, that's the number one thing we ought to be doing anyway, because all you have to do is look at what crimes are being committed with guns and what murders are being committed and where, and the statistics will tell you. It's illegal guns that are not possessed lawfully and being used in crime in our major cities. That's what it is. That's 99% of the crime. So that's what we should be focused on. Not on whether or not someone who collects firearms because they have an affinity for hunting or target shooting can buy more than 1 gun a month. That's not going to solve a single thing. It's not about whether folks should be able to open carry or not. That's not going to make any difference. It's not about changing the license fees to make it more difficult. Those things will do nothing to stop violence or crime or murder. Actually, going after the problem of the criminals that are involved And the illegal firearms that are being used in those crimes will. I'll make a point that, well, I'll skip over that. We'll save it. I'm almost done. Number 2, we should start reversing some of the bad policy that has been enacted over the last decade or more that undermines law enforcement and lets violent criminals get away with their crimes. Back in 2014, when I was on the floor, I was talking about the risk reduction credit program. At the time, I said that was contributing to violent crime in the state by letting people that have notorious criminal records out of prison early, having their sentences reduced. And we saw the result of some of that. I'm sorry that my good friend Senator Suzio is not here to enumerate it for us, because he could. He could tell us of a myriad of cases where people were let off from their prison sentences early and went on to commit other crimes, including murder. Our society is becoming more and more lawless over time, and that is a direct result of policies and rhetoric coming from the progressive left in this state and across the country. The third thing is mental illness. There's been a movement in this state and across this country to remove the stigma from people that have mental illness, and that is a very good thing, and that's an amazing thing. And I don't want anyone to misinterpret my remarks to suggest that somehow we should take people that are mentally ill and deprive them of their Second Amendment natural right. But the fact of the matter is there are some people that are dangerous as a result of their mental illness. And the thing is that we used to be able to identify those people, and we had a solution for that. We used to have facilities and policies that took that into consideration. Those have been all but wiped out. The other thing that I would point out is that when you look at these tragedies that have happened all across the country, that much like the one from yesterday, and we'll probably find this about yesterday too, and that is you find out that the person involved that committed the act was known to police. It's true in almost every case, and it makes you scratch your head and you say, how can this person who we knew was violent, who we knew had the propensity to do this, how could they be walking around without being monitored or in some way protecting the community? Those individuals are almost always known to law enforcement authorities. And finally, number 4 on my list that I listed a decade ago that we still have not really lived up to our ability, let alone our desire to achieve, and that is school security. If there's one thing that we could do to prevent a Sandy Hook from happening again or an event like in Nashville yesterday, that is school resource officers. That is a good guy with a gun. Because at the end of the day, that is the only real viable solution to stopping someone intent on causing harm. And if you want to protect kids in school from that happening, then you need school resource officers. There's no real other solutions than the 4 solutions that I mentioned. The items in this bill will have zero impact. They will only serve to tarnish our reputation further as a state that does not respect the rights, the constitutional natural rights of its citizens. Guns are not going away. They're not going to magically disappear by producing these policies and turning them into law. There are just too many guns in existence. And people should have a right to own and use firearms lawfully. But they can be stolen. They can be manufactured lawfully and unlawfully. These 4 items are the things that need to happen. Not making good people into criminals with page after page of regulations that only inconvenience good people who are not the problem and potentially disarm them and make them into victims. And none of the things in this bill are going to prevent future tragedies. I'm a hard no, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Representative Dubisky.